In this demo on creating a slicer section for your report, I'll be explaining how to transform the slicer visual into a variety of different types that users can use to filter your report. As mentioned in the instructional video, slicers are like the Swiss Army knife of data visualizations in Power BI. They have all kinds of useful forms that you can use for different situations. So here I already have some visuals on the page just for testing purposes so that we can demonstrate how the slicer works. We're going to make our first slicer by just going over to the visualizations pane here and going to the fifth row here, and this is your slicer. So we're going to add one to the report, and I'm going to pick a item from our games dataset and add that to the slicer. I'll just pick category. And you can see over here that immediately it created a list slicer. For most data types, this is going to be the default slicer that Power BI creates. And by default, most list slicers that Power BI generates are multi-select with control, meaning that if I try to select multiple items from this, notice that it's only letting me select one item at a time. The way that you have to get past this by default is just to hold down Control on your keyboard. Then you can multi-select. However, I like to just turn this off. It's kind of annoying and unintuitive to most users. They expect when they land on the page just to be able to select all the items that they want. So let's talk a little bit about the formatting options for the slicer first. If I have the slicer selected and I go to the visualizations pane and hit my format options, you can see all of your formatting for the slicer visual. And there's not a whole lot to choose from here. For this, I'm going to focus first on just the items themselves. So if I expand my items options, my items are the actual slicer values that I want to filter. And I can make the font size a little bit larger if I want to, which I will since this is a demo. And I'll change the font family to Calibri just to demonstrate how it works. You can also configure the slicer header, which is where it says category here and you have your eraser and you can select your slicer types. I'll bump up the size of that as well just a little bit. And here you have your selection controls, which is how you turn off that multi-select with control option that I was talking about. So if I turn off multi-select with control, now I can go over here and select as many items as I want to. You can also use the selection controls to turn on select all, meaning if you want users to be able to quickly exclude an item like racing or family. Usually I will turn off multi-select with control and turn on select all. It usually makes it easier for my users. So let's go ahead and put that slicer at the bottom, and let's just copy and paste it to create a new slicer. And in this slicer, instead of using category, I'm going to add title instead. And I'm going to delete category. So now I have a slicer that contains all the different titles of my video games. But of course, it's now pretty long just because there are so many different video game options. I would like for this to take up less space. So if I go to my caret up here in the top right corner, I can select the type of slicer. I can choose between list or drop down. I'm going to make this slicer a drop down just because it has a lot of values. You can immediately notice how much smaller it is now. All users have to do is select the larger caret to see the drop down menu, and then they can go through and select all the games that they want. Since there are a lot of games, in this case there's only 40, but let's imagine there were hundreds. If you click on the three dots here, you can add a search bar to this. And this just allows users to come in here and see a search bar so that they can type in, part of a title for a video game, and the list will automatically filter to help them make that selection. Another type of slicer that I personally really like is the slider slicer. But notice I can only choose between list and drop down when I have a text type field in the slicer. In order to make this a slider, I have to put either a numeric or a date field in this. So I'm going to choose our date column from our dates table. I'm going to add that to the slicer. Now, when I select the caret, I have many more options to choose from just because Power BI recognizes I'm using a date field. I'm going to select between, And notice that immediately it updates the slicer and turns it into a slider, where if I wanted to, instead of seeing January 1st, 2018 through the end of 2020, I just wanted to see a random date through 2020, I can do that. And you can drag these dials to anywhere you want, and that's why it's called a slider slicer, because you're literally just sliding these dials. And finally, the other type of slicer that I wanted to demonstrate here is a hierarchy slicer. And what I'll do is I'll copy and paste one of our list slicers, and I'll put this up here. And here I'm going to add year to the slicer. I'm going to delete category, and I'm going to add month short from our data set. And notice that by layering these two fields together in this list slicer, this slicer is immediately updated and it's slightly different. If you expand 2020, for example, notice that you can see all of the months under 2020, or you can close that, or you can expand 2019 and see all of the months under that. The hierarchy slicer just allows you to make more granular, kind of weird slicer selections than you might normally need to make. For example, if I wanted to compare, a quarter from one year compared to a different quarter in another year. So for this, I'm going to select January, February, and March from 2019. And I'm going to open 2020, and I'm going to select April, May, and June. This isn't necessarily something that you would do in a real case, but notice over here that it's actually showing me my 2019 quarter selection and my 2020 quarter selection. That's what you would use the hierarchy slicer for. And these are the main slicer configurations that we're going to use for the remainder of the course. Pretty easy to build all of them.